Hi everybody, Melissa here. And so today we are talking about the five afflictions. And so the five afflictions are also known as the Kleshas, and they're also sometimes commonly referred to as five poisons. And so these are essentially the root of our suffering. And so these come from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. If you're unfamiliar with that work, the Yoga Sutras are the yogic threads. That's what sutra means, kind of like suture, that interweaves the philosophy of the yoga practice with aphorisms or short phrases on how to live your life. And so we'll be talking about that today, the five afflictions and how it affects having PMDD. Of course, we know being someone with PMDD, we have a lot of afflictions. We go through a lot physically, psychologically, mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. And so the five afflictions, or the kleshas, they help us to understand where some of that suffering may come from. And so let's go ahead and we'll get right into it. Hope my screen sharing is working. All right. So the five kleshas are spiritual ignorance, avidya, egoism, asmita, attachment, raga, aversion, divesha, and clinging to life, abhinivesh. So this is from Sutra 2.3, and we are going to dive deep into what each of these five things means and how it applies to the yoga practice. And so we want to think that emotions or instincts that arise when our buttons are pushed that cause us to suffer or have a negative reaction instead of a positive reaction is essentially what a klesha is. And so when we break it all down, those five things end up falling into these categories of ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life, or dealing with our own mortality. You may think of it like that. And so each of the kleshas is a pointer toward unity. And so it's often that we may think when we talk about the negative that we are bringing it to the surface. We're actually making it worse by bringing it to light. We often to think that ignorance is bliss. That's a phrase, a saying that we're all probably commonly using. And so what this is saying is that even though we may be experiencing suffering, something may be coming up that is making us extremely uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that it's a thing we should run away from. And so as we get into this a little bit deeper, we'll see how avoiding things can also cause suffering. But kleshas help to point us toward unity because they're triggers that kind of arise spontaneously within us. We're not always conscious of what sort of things we'll find triggering. And so if we can start to notice when we're triggered, we can use that information for our practices, our self-care practices, our yoga practice, for helping us to understand how to bring ourselves back into balance or back toward unity. And so when our triggers are unconscious and they arise spontaneously, they can control us. They can wreak havoc in our life and how we're feeling and how we operate. And this, of course, is especially true from being a person with PMDD. And so, as you all know, our triggered responses, especially in luteal, can be much more dramatic. We can be hypersensitive, hypervigilant, hyper aroused when we are feeling diseased, so in an uneased state. And so because we know that the kleshas are fear-based and that they arise spontaneously, we can use practices, particularly the Kriya Yoga practices that we'll discuss at the end, to weaken the strength of these fear-based responses. And so if we can consciously shine a light on the root cause of our suffering, we can help to elevate our ability to respond positively, consciously, or at least have that awareness to know what is happening in the first place. And as I'm sure you can all relate to, with PMDD, having the awareness, the tracking is so important to begin with. It is so much easier to plan. It is so much easier to feel well when we have some awareness of what's going to happen. And so The kleshas, I think, are especially crucial for PMDD people because they can help us to break this chronic response cycle. And so this chronic cycle of rising and falling afflictions that we experience going from follicular ovulation to luteal to menses, we want to try to find a little bit more balance there. And it's not about being perfectly balanced, but using some of these ideas, some of this philosophy, and some of these practices to help us get there with a little more ease. All right, so each of the kleshas is a pointer towards unity. So we want to keep that in mind as we go forward, because it can seem like we're really focusing on the negative, but this is a pointer towards where our work is. And so the very first klesha is avidya. And this is Sutra 2.4, which reads, spiritual ignorance is the cause of the others, whether they are dormant, weak, interrupted, or sustained. And now this is really important because avidya is essentially the fertile landscape in which all of these other kleshas, all of these other triggers can, as we say, lie dormant or just uninterrupted. They're just kind of happening on their own and we're not paying attention to them. Ignorance of the situation, of the circumstance, of the trigger itself can cause our suffering. But this is also spiritual ignorance on a deeper level. This is a disconnection between our true essential self and the self that society has placed on us, our own expectations, our upbringing, the parameters perhaps of our religion, our profession. Those are things that can keep us really enclosed and really ignorant to our true self. As we go on, all of these things are going to play into one another, and you'll see how avidya really is the first one, and it helps to sustain the others. And so avidya can be very simple. It can simply be a lack of understanding, just not knowing, being unconscious. And so we can think of it as being in the dark about something, again, not knowing, separation from our true self, or a lack of awareness as to the truth of who we really are. And so that can be something simple of just not knowing that we've hurt someone's feelings, or not knowing that we have a disease like PMDD and what that means and how to organize our life around it. And so these are some practices that we want to use for working with this idea of avidya. And so I would recommend you grab your journal for this one, because we're going to do it in two ways. We're going to think about it in just a regular life experience, the circumstance that any of us could run into, and then also in this sense of as it relates to our PMDD. And so for this first little journal exercise, take a moment here to picture yourself putting on a shoe. And as you go to put it on, a giant spider crawls out of the inside and it startles you. You maybe throw your shoe, have a big reaction, and it's a fear-based reaction. If you had known that spider was in your shoe, would you have reacted differently? And if you did react differently, do you think your fear would have been a little bit less if that spider were sort of expected to be in there? So take a moment to kind of write down what you think you would have done. And then we'll revisit this, or we'll visit the second question when you are ready. And so now imagine that instead of it being a mystery as to what sort of symptoms you would be experiencing during the luteal phase or how weak in your cycle, imagine as though you knew exactly what was going to happen. Imagine that you knew day 12, you're going to be nauseous all day. Day 13, you would need to sleep all day. Day 14, you would be irritable. Whatever it may be, a combination thereof, doesn't have to be specific, but imagine you knew exactly what was going to happen once you entered the luteal phase. If you knew that, how would you prepare differently going into that part of your menstrual cycle? What would that change about your preparation or your planning? how would the experience change? Take a moment to think or journal on this. You can meditate on it as well if you like. Now we'll move on to our next klesha. Let's go backwards. All right, so our next one is asmita, egoism. And so egoism is the identification of the seer with the sense organs, which is Sutra 2.6, which I love so much because it's a really fancy way of saying you are not your body. Asmita is our I amness. So the things that we identify as ourselves that are maybe not entirely our whole selves. And so this may also mean identification with the personality as ourself. And it also means ego, or the opposite of ego, insecurity. And so both can be bad when we have too much or too little. And so asmita is also death by comparison. We don't want to compare ourselves to anyone else, because with some of these behavior patterns of comparison, we can prevent ourselves from doing what we need to move forward. If we go to our first yoga class and someone practicing nearby us has a very, very easy time with a practice we find extremely difficult, we may compare ourselves and say, oh, well, I guess this practice just isn't for me. But that is not the truth. There's no need to compare ourselves. That other individual may have been practicing for decades. And it also may be that they weren't entirely comfortable. It may have looked better to you, but it could have also been painful for them. We don't know. And so this helps us to remember to not judge and to release that idea of identifying just with our body, just with our accomplishments or our status, that we are more than that, and that I am should be connected to something much bigger. And so when we think about our ego, we can think about a situation maybe where we thought that we were better than everyone around us. And we maybe thought that we knew more, or that we had more, or that we deserved to be there more, whatever the situation may be. To recall that situation, and maybe there was a little bit of humbling in it for you. Maybe there was an opportunity for you to learn a little bit more, considering that perhaps the folks that you were with actually had something to teach you as well. Now, feel free to continue journaling on that point, or if you're ready to move on, we will go on to the second question here. And we'll think about ego as it relates to PMDD. And now we can imagine as though we only ever spent time in follicular, in what we may think of as our good times, as the real us. And that's typically where we feel more confident and energetic, where we might feel sexy. There's that bit of time towards the end of follicular before ovulation where we feel really sexy and in our fertility, perhaps. Imagine as though that were the only state you were ever in. While that may be nice, do you think you would still be as empathetic or as compassionate as you are? Would it serve you to always stay in that part of the cycle? Or is there something to be taken and learned from the luteal phase? Now, when we think of ego acting in our life, or this idea of asmita, this idea of feeling pressure to stay in an elevated status and to remain kind of on that high of life, or to separate ourselves from others by seeing ourselves as better in some degree. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is a common affliction for PMDD people per se, but I do think that there are things that capture our ego and pull us away from our true self. And so, as we close the yoga practice with this idea of namaste, which means I bow and acknowledge to the pure inner light of awareness within you, that it also resides within me, we can honor that through the weakening of our ego, through the part of us that wants to avoid any insecurity, avoid any feeling of insufficiency around any others. And it wants to be perceived as having it all together. That does not necessarily have to be true about who we are, and certainly cannot be true all the time. And so let's go ahead and move forward into our third klesha now. Attachment. And so attachment is that which rests on pleasant experiences. And so this is Sutra 2.7. Oof, and I think this is a big one. For me, I think the next two are some of the ones that I deal with the most. And so attachment, of course, is when we really like something, we tend to want more of it, not less. And so we can think of this just when we have our favorite candy. It's so just eat one piece. We always tend to want more of what we enjoy and less of what we don't enjoy, which we'll see with the next klesha. And so attachment is great in some ways. It allows us to have very human experiences. It allows us to connect with one another and form bonds. However, attachment can be very, very debilitating when we suffer if we do not have the thing or the person that we thought we might. And so whatever we are attached to is going to draw our interest. It's going to draw our effort, our experience. It's going to pull us away from that truth of who we are. And so this idea of attachment is raga, which is our anger, our attachment to our fight response. And this tends to be when we become trapped between our fears and our desires. And so when we really want something and we want to work really hard for it, and we want to make sure that we don't do anything to potentially harm it or compromise it. And so this attachment often comes with feeling attached to identities, and we can feel really attached to having a PMDD diagnosis, or even in some cases not having a PMDD diagnosis. And so when we start to attach ourselves and identify with the disease, then that limits us and labels us to a very small portion of the truth of who we really are. And so we want to try to avoid attaching and identifying with things that don't necessarily tell the whole story. Now, typically, raga is attached to pleasurable things. And so this is the idea of wanting more of an experience and wanting to make sure that the pain of not having the experience is avoided. So, of course, this is common with any sort of addiction. You don't want to ever run out of your stash. You want to make sure that you know you can continue to get more, that you know if you are going on vacation and going to be camping in the woods, you may still need to bring your coffee because of that addiction to the caffeine, to needing to make sure that you don't experience the caffeine withdrawal. And so we can see raga in a lot of different forms. It plays out in some of our habits and behavior. And then it also can arise because of emotional attachment to situations. And so I'm sure most of us have stayed in a relationship that was not good for us, or a situation that was not good for us, simply because it was familiar, because we had formed an attachment to it that made it feel like that was where we belonged, even if it didn't serve. And so we want to be careful to examine our attachments and ask ourselves with as much clarity as we can provide whether or not that is true about who we are. And so for our raga practice, we can think about a situation that we continued to return to. And so maybe it was a job that you hated, just absolutely hated, but couldn't bring yourself to quit. Maybe you thought that you owed it to your boss, or you owed it to a coworker that you worked with, or you had to make that level of money, whatever it may be. Take a moment to consider that for yourself. Why did you continue it? What was the pull? And if you did eventually break out of that attachment, how did you do it? Now, moving into our second question, when we think of attachment as it applies to having premenstrual dysphoric disorder, there may be aspects of ourselves that we feel really attached to that we lose once we move into luteal. For me personally, I tend to feel like I'm so productive, I can do so much, and I have so much energy during follicular. And then when I move into luteal, there tends to always be a little bit of suffering, especially right at the beginning, as I feel really at a loss for that productive self, that self that had so much energy to do so much. And I suffer because I feel like I have lost something about myself once I'm in this phase of my cycle. And so you may feel similarly. Maybe there's something specific that you are attached to, that you identify yourself as the real you, potentially in quotation marks from your follicular phase, that you may lose during luteal and may begin to feel as though you're suffering at the loss of that attachment. And so, whatever that may be, take a moment now to journal that. All right, so feel free to pause if you need to complete your entry. When you feel ready, we're going to move on to the fourth klesha, which is parallel to raga. It's kind of the opposite in some sense. which is aversion. And so aversion is that which rests upon full experiences. And so it's important to keep in mind that raga and devesha are both priorly formed. So these are from past experiences that we have labeled, identified, and want to either continue in the form of attachment or far away from in the form of aversion. And so aversion is, instead of clinging to past pleasure like raga, is clinging to past suffering. And so a really simple way of thinking about this is you tried a food that you didn't like and it made you feel very sick. And so you have never eaten that food again, even though it may be a truly wonderful food and it was just a bizarre, unrelated circumstance that made you sick. And so we tend to have a lot of aversions. And especially with PMDD, when we are in the hell week portion of our cycle and we're feeling extremely sensitive, we may have more aversions than usual. And so I know I personally get very light and sound sensitive. I want to be in quiet rooms and in quiet spaces. I don't want to be out in public. And so those aversions can help inform our practices, helping us to avoid certain triggers, but they can also limit us to staying too comfortable and not pushing past experiences to help us grow. And so this is also one of the basis of our stress responses. And so aversion is usually what triggers our fight or flight response that helps to cue our nervous system something is wrong and something needs to be changed. And so aversion is a powerful one because this is also one that is typically more habitual because we tend to really know what we don't like, right? There tends to be more knowledge about what we don't like and what we don't want than what we actually really do like. And so aversion can be one that's really, really challenging because we just don't want to have a menstrual cycle anymore. And often we choose not to have a menstrual cycle with PMDD because we cannot handle what the luteal phase brings. And of course, that is a totally valid way to experience PMDD, and that's a perfectly valid way to manage PMDD. But we can also see where other areas of our life where aversion plays a role that perhaps we can integrate those ways and not necessarily feel the need to run away from them. And so when we are in a state of resistance, of resisting what sort of changes are available to us, avoiding them, we can really bind ourselves up in that process. And so devesha is aversion. And so this is the basis of our stress response. And this is where we're going to fight. We're going to fight. We're going to have that nervous system deployment, the activation of stress hormones in our body, adrenaline and cortisol coursing through. And this is typically because it wants us to get out of Dodge, get out of there to feel safe. And so, again, this is a completely good thing to have in some sense. We, as our mammalian brain, we wanted to avoid and stay away from things that were potentially dangerous. But as we grow and change, we also want to make sure that we are not limited by what we try to stay away from. And so aversion can be an eye for an eye, thinking as though we have to, sorry, get back at someone or have, kind of um, a revenge mindset. Sorry, I don't know why that wasn't coming to my mind. And so it really is perpetuating negative energy. If we're trying to move into a space of an eye for an eye, we all know that that leaves the whole world blind. And so when we are trying to get rid of any painful or trauma experiences through avoiding them or through just not engaging with them in any way, that strengthens the trauma, it strengthens devesha because we're not actually applying any of the tools of awareness to diminish it. And so let's go ahead and look at our questions for this one. And so Devesha practice, you can imagine as though one of your five senses, in this case, you can do taste, and it could be any aversion you have to any specific food group. Or maybe, as I mentioned, it could be a light sensitivity. It could be something you hate to hear, like nails on a chalkboard. Take a moment to consider where this aversion came from. How did it come to be? Is it something from your early childhood? And then take a moment to consider, does it serve you? So in this case, it may not actually serve you to never eat asparagus again if you've had one bad experience with asparagus. Now, if you're allergic to asparagus, though, that might be a perfectly valid and reasonable thing to choose. And so take a moment to go ahead and journal your thoughts on that. And so we can move into our second question as it applies to PMDD. And that can really be that we just want to avoid PMDD itself. It would be nice to not just go through our cycles. However, there may be things about PMDD that you spend your time avoiding more than dealing with straight on. And so for me, one example of this is recognizing that when I consume dairy, my PMDD symptoms seem to be worse. And so for a long time, I continued to eat dairy, even though it didn't make me feel better. I avoided making that habit change of getting rid of dairy. And when I did do that, it seemed to make a significant difference in how I felt. But I was avoiding that change. Who wants to give up ice cream? I didn't. But once I did, it made a huge difference. So maybe take a moment to consider things that you may be avoiding when it comes to managing your PMDD to the best of your ability. And as you think of an example of what that may be, consider whether or not that serves you. So in my case, it didn't serve me. It made me feel worse when I consumed dairy. So you might continue to write on this topic. And again, keep in mind that these can be big or little things. So perhaps there's a communication issue with your partner that you leave unaddressed and it bubbles up each luteal phase, almost like clockwork, a thing that you could discuss when you're feeling a little bit better during follicular. Thinking of circumstances where we could potentially face whatever needs to be faced head on so that it doesn't hit us in the face later with PMDD symptoms. So let's go ahead and move to our last klesha. And so clinging to life, even the stages flow along with its own momentum. This is Sutra 2.9. And so this one is a little more challenging for a lot of people because we tend to not ever want to talk about death. We don't want to deal with or consider our own mortality. And so, of course, we also know that with PMDD, thinking about our own death is part of what we can experience. And suicidal ideation is one of the things that separates PMDD from other premenstrual disorders and can make it particularly scary and horrible to have your mind feed you some thoughts like this. And so I want to make sure that I'm really careful here, that I am in no way advocating death in any way. I think that life is wonderful and that we want to have a healthy relationship with our lived life as much as possible, where we don't live in fear of death, but with the understanding that that is a natural result of having experienced life in the first place. And so that ideally comes with old age, late into our life. And in the meantime, we have the opportunity to practice living life to its fullest and learning how to manage this disease with as much graciousness, compassion, and healing as possible. And so let's go ahead and go forward. And so Abhinivesha or Abhinivesha, depending on the practice, is that fear of death and loss. But it's also this idea of a lack of a global or cosmic vision. And so this essentially means forgetting the truth of who you are, that you are not necessarily your body, you are not necessarily your feelings and sensations, you are the one experiencing those things. You are not the thinker, you are not the thoughts, you are the thinker. And beyond all that, you are an energy that will continue to persist because we know that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. So we do exist, we are currently existing, and we will continue to exist in a different energy, perhaps than what we occupy right now, a different vessel perhaps, but not in a sense where we are able to just perish ultimately, where we are no longer in existence entirely. And so most major religious practices and beliefs do believe in some form of afterlife. Whether you believe that or not, it is possible and I think more comforting to think of ourselves as a part of a much, much bigger whole, where there is energy being shared throughout the universe, throughout the cosmos, that we are a part of, that we're a drop in the ocean and also the ocean itself. And so when we think about the fear of death, there's a lot of things that can make us feel totally out of control when we are feeling pain physically, mentally, emotionally, when we can feel as though there is a shortness to our life or a true sense of fallibility. And so we don't necessarily want to diminish that or get rid of it. The idea of having a healthy fear of death is probably good. Most of us don't professionally jump from airplanes or do anything that is extremely dangerous, because there is that very primal instinct to want to live. And of course, we are imbued with that and not necessarily choosing that. And so having a healthy relationship with it and understanding that it is a normal and natural part of the life cycle, and not necessarily trying to avoid every aspect of it entirely. My partner and I are currently watching Altered Carbon on Netflix, and it's interesting because it seems as though almost the whole premise of the show is an avoidance of grief. There has been some technology discovered that prevents people from dying if they can upload themselves into basically a chip, a memory bank that allows them to occupy different bodies and essentially live forever. And so it is a compelling moral and ethological question, a compelling philosophical question, but it also does highlight how afraid we are of dealing with our own mortality. And so This is a question I really like. I think this is a thing I personally find really, really challenging. Let's say you're sitting on an airplane and you begin to experience turbulence and it starts to rise and fall sharply. And now in this situation, you are not the pilot, you are a passenger on this airplane and you don't have control over the, the weather. You can't control the plane itself. So what do you do? How do you relax? How do you try to make peace with what you're experiencing? What does that look like? So, as Nikolai Bachman says, abhinivesha is a deep seated involvement in the process of dualities, such as pleasure and pain, and an addiction to the game of the Kleshas. Fear is based on attachments such as raga and devesha. Being caught in the wheels of dualities, we identify with them and see ourselves as a conglomeration of such things as our thoughts, possessions, preferences, and family. Egotism, asmita, keeps us bound to who it thinks we are. But death, like time, exists only in the ever changing manifest world. That pure light of awareness resting within each of us was never born and will never die. It is perpetual and eternal. And so with PMDD, we can often feel like the universe is an adversary instead of the source of our being. When we're in the throes of our symptoms, feeling off kilter in virtually every way, we can experience ourselves as limited, defective, or incomplete. And this infinite timeless consciousness that we are perceiving as such is simply the truth. We are not limited, we are not defective, and we are certainly not incomplete. Believing those things will help to strengthen those things. And we want to diminish and weaken that belief and ultimately increase our understanding of our deep interconnectedness, connected to whatever higher source we may name, even if that highest source isn't necessarily like a religious figure, it can be a higher source of goodness, a higher source of just the universe itself, the magic of science and how our limited understanding of the world is continually growing. And so, again, I want to make sure that it's understood that I'm not advocating for death in any way. I certainly have a healthy fear of death myself. But as I think some of you may know, my brother was killed suddenly in 2017, forcing me to really look at death very closely, very head on, and my own mortality, in understanding that if my 27-year-old brother can die suddenly, so can I. And so there is always work to be done in this area because this is so deeply rooted in our consciousness. But if we can help to weaken this belief, we can live our life more fully. And so Sutra 211 says, meditation will overcome the fluctuations of consciousness caused by the afflictions. And so this sounds very easy and very simple. Oh, if only it were that easy. We all know that it is not, But this meditation dhyana is this ability to sit with some of these discomforts, to overcome those fluctuations of consciousness that are caused by the afflictions, to help free us. And so when we can practice with determination, with enthusiasm, to shine the light of awareness on these afflictions, then we can help to diminish and weaken them. And so we do have a very particular way to do that, which is so wonderful that not only does it identify the problems, but it can help us to solve them. And these are the practices of Kriya Yoga. And so Kriya Yoga is essentially three practices, and they are identified as tapas, svadhyaya, svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. And so tapas typically means heat. It is the heat of um, burning away that which is no longer serving us, burning away the things that are residual to our being, that are not the truth of who we are, that do not actually help us to move forward, that are almost like just gunk stuck to the outside of you. And so it's sometimes thought of as a burning intensity, a fire within, and our practice. So tapas typically is our practice. What are we practicing, and how are we helping to use those practices to move forward in how we're feeling? So tapas typically is a positive change. Svadhyaya, which I know I'm not saying properly, I apologize, but this is our self-study or self-observation, which is key to helping to weaken our kleshas, because if we are not aware of what our triggers are, we can do nothing to alleviate them. If we aren't aware of what our habituated responses and reactions are, then we cannot do anything to react differently. And so this self-study is our way of shining a light, be growing awareness, and awakening back to that truth of who we are, back to our inner essence. And then finally, Ishvara Pranidhana is humility with faith. And this is also sometimes considered surrender or devotion to a supreme being. And it doesn't say which. The Yoga Sutras are a philosophy and not necessarily a religious doctrine. So there is no implication that the faith needs to be applied to one particular deity. It can simply be faith in what is, or faith that allows you to rest in a higher knowledge of a higher purpose. And so with the use of humility and faith, we can reduce that identification with the personality and that separation from our higher self or our divine self. And so these three things can work together to greatly impact our relationship with the kleshas. So we don't necessarily have to feel like we are being organized around our triggers, that our triggers are controlling us. We can start to feel much more as though we are controlling ourselves, feeling like we're the one in the driver's seat. And so when we think about being open-minded to apply tapas, svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana, we can do this through the practice of meditation. So we can think about finding opportunities to clear away with diligent practice, with keen discernment, an effort to purify our mind, to purify our habit patterns, and find the opportunity to respond in a way that releases and hopefully redirects, creates a different neural pattern, a different neural network of responses. And so when we think about our ego with asmita, we want to think about observing how we behave, noticing when we receive, extra attention, if that inflates our ego, and how we behave when that happens. Or by consciously reminding ourselves that there is no difference between us and anybody else. no matter what another person's position or income, status, title, color, creed, whatever may be different about you and that person. There ultimately is no hierarchy of being. There is only our habituated responses. So when we feel like we are into ourselves too much, we are observing that through the practice of svadhyaya, and then we can transfer that pompous feeling about ourselves to a higher source using Ishvara Pranidhana. And so we can think about transferring that feeling and giving credit to someone else. So typically this is done in the yoga practice by giving credit to our teachers. There's no way that I would be able to share what I know with you if someone had not first shared what they know with me. And so having that humility to acknowledge that we are not the source, but we are connected to it. And so you can see how these kriyas can start to play a role in some of how these kleshas come up. And so, for example, in the case of raga, with our long-standing tendencies to want to attach ourselves to something and keep it for ourselves, we again can notice that, notice our habits, what we kind of experience in terms of, what are our attachments? Like, is there a particular thing that you need every day? For some people, it might be a cup of coffee. For some people, it may be, a certain way that you always need to look before you can be considered presentable to someone else. And so whatever those attachments may be, observing them, again, is through the practice of svadhyaya, and then trying to ignore those tendencies or subvert them in some way, direct them to a different place, a different, not different attachment, but a different habit. So not that we necessarily want it to become as all consuming as the one we are trying to redirect, but noticing if you do need to have a cup of coffee every day, how would it feel to instead maybe start with a cup of tea and let yourself enjoy your cup of tea differently, especially if you're enjoying some of these attachments almost mechanically. And then we apply tapas when we are realizing that we want to make the effort to change that thing. So I tend to like to think of them in the opposite direction. I think having the self-observation piece sometimes needs to come first, because before we can make the change, we need to know what we're trying to change. But also it can be really hard to make a change if, or excuse me, it can be really hard to observe ourselves if we have no willingness to make that change. So they're probably in the right order. They've been in the right order for thousands of years. But I do think the observation piece definitely helps to influence what we will change and how we will use that change. And so these essentially apply to all of the kleshas. There are ways where we can weaken them by becoming aware and then using that self inquiry to examine it, talking to others about it, maybe making a plan to change it, applying tapas, and then surrendering the outcome, the circumstances, to a higher source, noticing that if you are becoming attached to your results in whatever you're trying to change, you are sliding back into raga, back into the kleshas, and you want to let go of that. We don't necessarily want to be attached to the fruits of our labor. We want to plant our garden simply to watch it grow and to maybe sit in the shade of our trees. And so with Kriya yoga practices, these are the practices that we apply all the time, not just on our yoga mat, but these are the areas of our life that we become acquainted with just by simple consideration, learning to observe, desiring to want to make a positive change, and then surrendering in our in what we think that has to look like. And so oftentimes we think that change can only be one way, but when in fact it can go any way, that it can look like many different things, and it does not always have to look exactly as we think it should. We don't want to should on ourselves. So we want to surrender with humility to something that helps to promote our faith. And so if you have any questions or comments about this and about how it would perhaps help you, we can go in more in depth. I am here to help. I want to talk to you more about this and truly help to increase our glossary of terms of how we talk about the things that we may suffer from and talk about PMDD in the context of therapeutic yoga. And so feel free to email me at any time. I would love to hear from you. You can comment on the post in the Patreon as well. And remember that these things are not just things that happen on your yoga mat. If you take anything from this practice today, remembering that there is so much power in observing and attempting to change and doing so with as little expectation as possible. And so I hope that this has been informative and that it will help you to have a better relationship with some of the root causes of your suffering. And as I say, if you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to reach out. Take great care of yourself, my friend, and I will see you next time.